My name is Ellie Parker, and I'm 27 years old. This happened in October of last year, but the memory still clings to me like a second skin. I don't talk about it much. Hell, I hardly sleep without the lights on anymore, but I'm writing this because people need to know. They need to stay away from Devil's Hollow. It all started as a project for my YouTube channel, Haunted Highways. I'd been exploring urban legends for years, turning skeptic-driven investigations into clickbait gold. My channel was my life, and I'd go anywhere for the perfect shot. So, when I heard about Devil's Hollow in Fort Wayne, Indiana, a place infamous for disappearances, strange sightings, and even rumors of cult activity, I knew I had to go. Lucas, my best friend since childhood, didn't love the idea. He's the cautious type, the guy who carries bear spray even when we're camping in places without bears. But he came anyway because he never lets me down. Maya, my paranormal-loving friend, jumped at the chance, giddy to dive into the legends. Ethan, my boyfriend, tagged along too, mainly because he hated the idea of me out in the woods without him. We parked our RV at the edge of the woods, right off the narrow, winding Devil's Hollow Road. The place lived up to its name. The trees seemed unnaturally close together, their branches intertwining to block out the sun. Everything was eerily quiet. No birds, no bugs, just the rustle of leaves in the wind. "Spooky enough for you?" Ethan joked, shoving the RV keys into his pocket. Maya, clutching her leather-bound notebook, grinned. "Oh, this is perfect. You can feel the energy here. It's heavy." "Yeah," Lucas muttered, adjusting the strap of his backpack. "Heavy with bad ideas." I ignored them, busy setting up the camera gear. "We'll hike a little, film some B-roll, and camp here overnight. Easy." Things started going wrong almost immediately. The RV's engine sputtered and coughed as Ethan tried to restart it after parking. "Great," he said, smacking the dashboard. "Looks like we're stuck here for now." Lucas shot me a look. "You didn't check the RV before we left?" "It's fine," I said, brushing him off. "We'll deal with it later." That night, as we sat around a small fire, the eeriness of the hollow began to sink in. Maya kept scribbling in her notebook, muttering about protective symbols and curses. Ethan rolled his eyes and made sarcastic jokes, but even he kept glancing over his shoulder. Then, just as we were settling in, we heard it. Distant chanting. It was faint, like a breeze carrying whispers, but unmistakable. "Did you hear that?" Maya whispered, her face pale. "Probably just the wind," Ethan said, though his voice wavered. Lucas stood, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "I'm going to check it out." "I'll go with you," I said, grabbing my camera. We followed the sound into the woods, our flashlights bouncing off the twisted trees. The chanting grew louder, but remained indistinct, like a dozen voices speaking in a language I couldn't place. Suddenly, Lucas froze. "Ellie, look!" Hanging from the branches were crude dolls made of sticks and twine. They swung gently in the breeze, their hollow eyes seeming to watch us. "Okay, that's creepy," I admitted, filming them. Lucas frowned. "This doesn't feel right. Let's go back." As we turned, I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye. A deer, standing just beyond the flashlight's reach. Its eyes reflected the light, glowing unnaturally bright. But when I looked closer, the figure was gone. The next morning, Ethan went off alone to collect firewood while Lucas and I tried to troubleshoot the RV's engine. Maya stayed near the camp, arranging bundles of sage she'd brought just in case. When Ethan returned, he was unusually quiet. "Everything okay?" I asked. He nodded but avoided eye contact. "Yeah, just thought I saw... Never mind." "What did you see?" Maya pressed. Nothing, he snapped. But that night, as we sat in the RV playing cards, Ethan admitted he'd seen something strange. It looked like a deer, he said, staring at the table, but its legs were too long, and it was standing on 2 feet for a second. I thought I was imagining it, but he trailed off, shaking his head. Maya went pale. Skinwalkers, she whispered. Lucas groaned. Not this again. I'm serious, Maya said. They're shapeshifters, spirits that can take on animal forms to trick or hunt people. It's not a joke. Ethan laughed nervously. Yeah, well, whatever it was, it's gone now. That night, the RV felt too small, the darkness outside too thick. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of my own voice. Ellie, come out here! I froze, my heart hammering. It was me, but I was inside the RV. Ellie! The voice called again, more insistent. I scrambled to wake Lucas, who was sleeping on the couch. Do you hear that? He sat up, groggy, but when the voice came again, he was wide awake. That's not you. We both grabbed flashlights and stepped outside, the others following behind us. The fire had gone out, leaving the clearing in darkness. Ellie! The voice called from the woods. We shone our lights toward the trees, and that's when we saw it. A figure standing just beyond the tree line. It was humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its face eerily smooth. Maya screamed, and the figure bolted deeper into the woods, moving unnaturally fast. Panic set in. Ethan suggested leaving immediately, but the RV still wouldn't start. Maya insisted on performing a protective ritual, scattering salt around the campsite and burning sage. They're toying with us, she said, her voice shaking. We need to hold out until morning. But the skinwalkers didn't let up. All night they circled the RV, their distorted voices calling to us. At one point, we heard Ethan's voice shouting for help outside. Don't go out there, Maya warned as Ethan reached for the door. That's me out there, he snapped. No, it's not, she cried, grabbing his arm. The arguing stopped when something slammed against the RV. We all froze, listening as claws scraped across the metal. By dawn, we were exhausted and terrified. Ethan, impatient and defiant, decided to confront the creatures head-on. He grabbed a flashlight and stormed into the woods despite our protests. I'm not sitting here waiting to die, he shouted. We waited for hours, but he didn't return. When we finally worked up the courage to search for him, all we found was his flashlight lying in the dirt, and his camera. The footage was horrifying. It showed Ethan walking through the woods, shouting curses at the creatures. Then the camera shook violently, and his screams echoed before the video cut off. With no other option, we piled into the RV, praying it would start. Lucas turned the key, and by some miracle, the engine roared to life. As we drove away, I glanced back and saw them. Humanoid figures standing at the edge of the trees, their glowing eyes fixed on us. One of them had Ethan's face. We never spoke of it again. I abandoned my channel, Maya stopped her paranormal research, and Lucas moved to another state. Ethan was never found. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I hear his voice calling my name. Stay away from Devil's Hollow. Some places were never meant to be explored. My name is Caleb Monroe, and I'm 35 years old. Last September, I parked my RV at Indiana Dunes National Park, hoping for a few days of peace and quiet to clear my head. I thought it would be another routine solo camping trip. Just me, the sand, and the sound of waves to drown out the noise in my mind. I was wrong. Something happened in those dunes that I'll never forget. Something I still don't fully understand. I arrived on a crisp Thursday afternoon, just as the golden sunlight stretched across the dunes, casting long shadows over the rolling sands. The campground was practically deserted, which suited me fine. I'm not a fan of crowds. The ranger at the entrance warned me to stick to marked trails and avoid venturing too far into the dunes. "Easy to get lost out there," she'd said with a strange seriousness. My RV was parked in a small clearing surrounded by swaying beach grass and a few sparse trees. The lake glistened in the distance, its waves lapping rhythmically against the shore. After setting up camp, I sat by the fire pit, letting the stillness seep into me. It was the kind of quiet I'd been craving for months. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I heard something, faint, almost like a whisper carried on the breeze. At first, I thought it was the wind playing tricks on me, but then I heard it again, a soft, stuttering sob. I stood up, every muscle in my body tensing. The sound was coming from the dunes, beyond the glow of my campfire. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped cautiously into the darkness. "Hello," I called, my voice cutting through the stillness. The sobbing stopped abruptly. Then, just as I was about to turn back, I saw her. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, standing barefoot in the sand. She wore a faded pink dress that looked too light for the chilly night air. Her hair was tangled, her face streaked with dirt and tears. "Hey, are you okay?" I asked, approaching slowly. She looked up at me with wide, frightened eyes, but didn't say anything. "Where's your family?" I crouched down to her level. "Are you lost?" She shook her head, her tiny hands clutching the hem of her dress. "I don't know," she whispered. I felt a surge of unease, but I pushed it aside. "Come on, let's get you warmed up." Back at the RV, I gave her a blanket and some water. She perched on the edge of the couch, watching me warily as I stoked the fire in the small wood stove. "What's your name?" I asked. "Maggie," she said softly. "Okay, Maggie. Do you know how you got out there?" She shook her head again, staring down at her hands. "Do you remember your parents? Where you're from?" Her lip quivered, and she whispered, "I think they left me." Something about the way she said it sent a shiver down my spine. Her words didn't sound like the confusion of a lost child. They sounded like the realization of something terrible. The first real sign that something was wrong came later that night. Maggie was asleep on the couch, wrapped in the blanket, while I sat by the fire, trying to make sense of the situation. The ranger station was a good drive away, and there was no cell service this far out. I'd planned to take Maggie there first thing in the morning. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside, soft but deliberate, circling the RV. I froze, listening as they paused near the door. "Who's out there?" I shouted, grabbing the flashlight and wrenching the door open. The dunes stretched out before me, empty and silent under the moonlight. No footprints in the sand, no signs of life. But as I stood there, scanning the horizon, I saw it. A shadow moving across the dunes, too tall and too thin to be human. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my heart pounding. Maggie sat up, rubbing her eyes. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Nothing," I lied. "Go back to sleep." But I couldn't sleep, not after that. The next morning, things got stranger. Maggie refused to eat or drink, even when I offered her the oatmeal I'd made. "I'm not hungry," she said, her voice distant. When I pressed her about her family again, her answers were vague, like she couldn't remember or didn't want to. I decided to take her to the ranger station right after breakfast, but as I was packing up, I noticed something unsettling. Footprints circling the RV, just like the ones I'd heard the night before. Except these weren't normal footprints. They were long and narrow, almost claw-like, and they didn't lead anywhere. "Maggie," I said carefully, "did you see anyone outside last night?" She hesitated, then nodded. "They're watching us," she whispered. By the time the sun started setting, I was on edge. We hadn't left the campsite, the RV wouldn't start. I'd checked the engine 3 times, and everything seemed fine, but it just wouldn't turn over. As night fell, the whispers returned, louder this time. They came from all around us, mingling with the rustling of the beach grass. Maggie sat silently on the couch, staring out the window. "Who's watching us?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She turned to me, her eyes wide with fear. "The shadows." I didn't know what to say. I'd always prided myself on being rational, but nothing about this made sense. That night was worse than the last. The whispers grew louder, almost like voices murmuring just outside the RV. Shadows flickered in the corners of my vision, but when I turned, there was nothing there. At one point, I heard Maggie crying and rushed to her side, but when I reached her, she wasn't crying. She was staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. "They want you to leave me," she said. "What?" "They think you'll leave, like everyone else." I wanted to reassure her, but the words caught in my throat. By the 3rd day, I was desperate. I decided to try hiking to the ranger station, even if it meant leaving Maggie alone for a while. But as I prepared to leave, she grabbed my arm. "You can't," she said, her voice urgent. "Why not?" "They'll hurt you." "Who, Maggie?" I knelt down, looking her in the eyes. "Who are they?" Her lip quivered. "The shadows. They come from the dunes. They like it when people are scared and alone." I didn't want to believe her, but the evidence was all around me. The whispers, the footprints, the broken RV. Whatever was out there didn't want us to leave. That night, they made their move. The whispers turned into voices, mocking, taunting, repeating my own thoughts and fears. The shadows grew darker, solidifying into humanoid figures that pressed against the windows. Maggie clung to me, her small hands trembling. "You have to stop them," she said. "How?" She hesitated, then whispered, "There's something buried in the dunes. Something they're bound to. You have to destroy it." With no other choice, I grabbed a flashlight and ventured into the dunes, Maggie at my side. The shadows swirled around us, their whispers growing deafening. Finally, we found it. A weathered box buried in the sand, covered in strange symbols. Maggie stepped back, her eyes wide. "That's it." I didn't think I just acted. Using my pocket knife, I pried the box open. Inside was a blackened artifact, something ancient and menacing. As soon as I shattered it against a rock, the shadows let out an unearthly wail and dissolved into the night. When I turned to Maggie, she was smiling, sad but free. "Thank you," she said softly. Before I could respond, she began to fade, her form dissolving like mist in the wind. The RV started without a hitch the next morning. As I drove away, I glanced back at the dunes one last time and saw a single pair of tiny footprints leading into the waves. I don't know what Maggie was, but she saved me, and I'll never forget her. My name is Rebecca Hall, though most people call me Becky, and I'm 32 years old. This happened last fall, during a solo camping trip in the Deem Wilderness area of Hoosier National Forest, Indiana. I'd planned the trip as a way to scout new trails for the survival course I teach. A week of solitude and self-reliance. I didn't believe in the ghost stories about the area or the legends of the so-called forest devil. Back then, I thought I was too grounded for superstitions. But what I experienced out there, I still can't fully explain. It started off fine. I drove my RV deep into the wilderness, past the well-trafficked trails and into the heart of the forest. The farther I went, the quieter it got, until the only sounds were the hum of my engine and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. I parked in a small clearing, surrounded by dense woods. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and I felt the familiar rush of excitement I always got at the start of a trip. My plan was to spend a week here, hiking and mapping out routes that I could recommend to my students. The first 2 days were uneventful. I hiked during the day, marking my trail with colored ribbons tied to branches. I'd stop to sketch out potential landmarks in my notebook or practice some basic survival skills like building fires without matches. At night, I returned to the RV, tired but satisfied. But on the third day, things started to go wrong. It began with my compass. I was on a trail I'd marked the day before when I noticed the needle spinning aimlessly. At first, I thought it was a cheap compass malfunctioning, but then I realized something else. The trees looked different. The tall oaks and maples that had lined the trail were gone, replaced by gnarly, twisted trees that seemed to lean toward me. I felt a flicker of unease, but I told myself I must have veered off course. I turned back, following my ribbons, except the ribbons were gone. The ones I'd tied to branches just the day before had vanished without a trace. By the time I made it back to the RV, I was shaken. The forest felt alive, as though it had shifted while I wasn't looking. That night, I had my first encounter with the voices. I was sitting by the fire, scribbling notes in my notebook, when I heard it. A faint whisper, just beyond the light of the flames. "Becky?" I froze, my pen hovering above the paper. The voice was soft, almost familiar, but I couldn't place it. "Becky!" it called again, louder this time. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the tree line. "Hello?" I called. "Is someone out there?" The light revealed nothing but the dense tangle of trees. Still, the whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent. I backed into the RV and locked the door, my heart hammering. The next morning, I told myself I'd imagined the voices, that the isolation was playing tricks on my mind. But as I stepped outside, I found something that made my blood run cold. Footprints. They circled the RV, large and deep, as though something heavy had been pacing all night. And they weren't human. The prints were long and narrow, almost claw-like, and they didn't lead anywhere. They just started and ended abruptly, as if whatever had made them had vanished into thin air. I decided to cut my trip short. The forest felt wrong, like it was watching me. But when I tried to start the RV, the engine sputtered and died. "Come on," I muttered, turning the key again. Nothing. I spent the rest of the day checking the engine, but everything seemed fine. The fuel tank was full, the battery was charged, yet the RV wouldn't budge. That night, the voices returned, louder and more distinct. This time, I recognized one of them. "Becky," it said, in a voice I knew all too well. Michael's voice, my ex-boyfriend. I stumbled outside, flashlight in hand, scanning the darkness. Michael? There, just beyond the firelight, I saw him. He stood with his hands in his pockets, looking exactly as he had the last time I'd seen him. "Michael?" I whispered. He didn't respond, just stared at me with an expression that sent chills down my spine. Then he turned and walked into the woods. Against my better judgment, I followed him. I trailed Michael's figure through the trees, calling his name, but he never looked back. The farther I went, the more disoriented I became. The forest seemed to twist and shift around me, the trees leaning closer as though trying to block my path. Finally, Michael stopped. When I reached him, I saw his face clearly for the first time. It wasn't Michael at all. It was something else, something wearing his face like a mask. Its eyes, were wrong, black and hollow, and its smile stretched too wide. "Why did you leave me, Becky?" it whispered, its voice a distorted mockery of Michael's. I stumbled back, my stomach churning. "You're not real." It laughed, a low, guttural sound that echoed through the trees. "You can't leave. You belong to the forest now." I ran. The shadows seemed to close in around me, their whispers turning into a deafening cacophony. I tripped and fell, the cold earth pressing against my hands. When I looked up, the creature was gone, but the forest was alive with movement. Branches twisting, leaves rustling without wind. I didn't stop running until I reached the RV. I knew I couldn't outrun whatever was in the forest, so I decided to fight. Using what little fuel I had left in a spare container, I fashioned a makeshift torch. If this thing wanted to mess with me, it would have to do it in the light. I stepped outside, the torch blazing in my hand. "Come on!" I shouted into the darkness. "Show yourself." The whispers grew louder, and then it appeared. A massive, shadowy figure with glowing red eyes. It moved like smoke, shifting and undulating, but its presence was suffocating. "You can't hurt me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The creature laughed. "I don't need to hurt you. You'll destroy yourself, just like all the others." It lunged at me, but I swung the torch, the flames driving it back. I remembered the stories I'd heard about the forest devil, about how it was bound to an artifact buried deep in the woods. "You want me?" I shouted. "Then let's finish this." I followed the creature to a clearing, where the ground seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. Digging frantically with my hands, I unearthed a small, charred box covered in strange carvings. The creature screamed as I smashed the box with a rock, the sound reverberating through the forest. The shadows dissipated, the whispers fading into silence. When I returned to the RV, it started on the first try. The forest was still and quiet, as though whatever had plagued it was finally gone. I left the dim wilderness the next morning, vowing never to return. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that the forest devil isn't gone. It's just waiting for its next victim. And sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers outside my window calling my name. My name is Travis Carter. I'm 29 years old, a mechanic by trade, and an outdoorsman by passion. What I'm about to tell you happened last fall, on a weekend trip to the Knobstone Trail in southern Indiana. I'd always loved the outdoors. Something about the solitude of the wilderness gave me peace. But after what I experienced that weekend, I can't step into the woods without looking over my shoulder. It all started when my best friend Dylan convinced me to take him camping. Dylan was 28, the kind of guy who could light up a room with his humor but didn't have much sense when it came to practical things. We'd been friends since high school, but we'd drifted apart recently after a falling out over one of his usual screw-ups. I thought this trip might mend things between us. We set out on a Friday afternoon, the RV loaded with supplies. Dylan brought his own gear, but knowing him, I checked it. Sure enough, his flashlight flickered weakly, and his tent looked like something a stiff breeze could tear apart. I grumbled about it, but he just laughed and said, "Relax, man. It's not like we're climbing Everest." The drive down was uneventful until the RV sputtered and died about 5 miles from our intended campsite near Delaney Creek. Dylan joked, "Guess it's an authentic adventure now." But I wasn't laughing. We grabbed what we could carry and started the hike, the autumn air brisk and the leaves crunching underfoot. The trail wound through dense forest, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows. It was nearly dusk when we reached a clearing and set up camp. The tension between us was starting to show. Dylan kept cracking jokes, trying to lighten the mood, but I was already annoyed by his lack of preparation. After an argument about the firewood, he brought back damp logs. I decided to focus on cooking dinner. That's when I heard it for the first time. Laughter. It was faint, almost like the sound of children playing in the distance. I paused, the hair on my arms standing on end. Dylan must have noticed my reaction because he said, "What's up? Hear something?" "Probably just the wind," I replied, though I didn't believe it. The sound carried through the trees, fading in and out. And it didn't seem random like wind or animals. It had rhythm like human voices. We ate in silence, the firelight dancing on the trunks of the surrounding trees. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest grew unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that makes you strain to hear anything. That's when Dylan pointed toward the edge of the clearing. "What's that?" he whispered. I followed his gaze and saw it. A deer standing unnaturally still, its eyes glowing in the firelight. At first, I thought it was just curious, but something about its posture was wrong. It didn't move, didn't twitch its ears or shift its weight. It was like a statue. "Creepy," Dylan muttered. "Probably wants marshmallows." "Deer don't act like that," I said, my voice low. We stared at it for what felt like an eternity before it turned and walked into the woods, its movements stiff and jerky. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool night air. "We should keep the fire going," I said, throwing another log on the flames. The night grew colder, and we retreated into our tents. Dylan fell asleep quickly, his snores breaking the stillness, but I couldn't relax. I lay there, listening to the sounds of the forest, or rather, the lack of them. No crickets, no owls, just an oppressive silence. Then I heard it. A voice calling my name. "Travis." It was faint, like it was carried on the wind, but it was unmistakable. My heart pounded as I sat up, straining to hear. The voice came again, this time louder and from the direction of the woods. "Travis, help me." I unzipped my tent and stepped out into the clearing, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Dylan," I called, though I knew the voice wasn't his. It sounded like him, but off, like someone trying to mimic his tone and failing. Behind me, Dylan's tent rustled. He stuck his head out, groggy and annoyed. "What the hell are you doing?" "Did you hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" His irritation vanished when he saw the look on my face. "What's going on?" Before I could answer, the voice came again. "Travis, over here." Dylan's eyes widened. "Okay, that's creepy. Is someone messing with us?" I shook my head. "I don't think so." We stood there, frozen, as the voice called out again, this time from a different direction. "Travis, Dylan, come here." We grabbed our flashlights and moved closer to the edge of the clearing, scanning the trees. That's when we saw the tracks. They were large, misshapen prints that seemed to shift between human and animal characteristics. I knelt to examine them, my stomach twisting. What kind of animal makes tracks like these? "Bigfoot?" Dylan joked weakly, but I could hear the fear in his voice. The laughter returned, louder this time, echoing from all around us. It wasn't playful anymore, it was mocking. Dylan started to panic. "Okay, we need to get the hell out of here." I agreed, but before we could move, a figure stepped into the firelight. It was Dylan, or rather, something that looked like him. The features were identical, but the smile was too wide, the eyes too bright. It just stood there, grinning at us. Dylan stumbled back, nearly tripping over his own feet. What is that?" "I don't know," I whispered, my throat dry. "But we're not staying to find out." The figure began to move toward us, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. I grabbed a burning log from the fire and hurled it at the thing. It let out an unearthly screech and vanished into the shadows. "Run!" I shouted. We sprinted toward the trail, our flashlights bobbing wildly as we navigated the uneven terrain. The laughter followed us, growing louder and more distorted, until it sounded like a chorus of voices. The forest seemed alive, the trees closing in on us as if trying to trap us. We reached the RV, panting and terrified. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, while Dylan kept glancing over his shoulder. "Hurry up, man." As soon as we got inside, I locked the doors and grabbed the flare gun and bear spray from the emergency kit. Dylan peeked out the window, his face pale. "It's out there." I followed his gaze and saw it. No, them. Several figures stood at the edge of the clearing, their forms shifting between human and animal. They just stood there, watching. One of them moved closer, its shape flickering like a bad TV signal. It pressed its face against the window, its features a grotesque mimicry of mine. "Let us in," it said. Its voice a warped imitation of my own. Dylan screamed, and I raised the flare gun, aiming at the thing's face. "Get away from us," I shouted, pulling the trigger. The flare exploded in a blinding light, and the creature let out a guttural howl, retreating into the darkness. The others followed, their screams echoing through the night. We didn't sleep. As dawn broke, the forest seemed to come alive again with the normal sounds of birds and rustling leaves. But the damage was done. We left the RV and hiked to the nearest ranger station, where we reported what had happened. They looked at us like we were crazy, but I didn't care. To this day, I don't know what we encountered on the Knobstone Trail. Some say it was a skinwalker, a creature from Native American folklore. Others think it was a shared hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion. But I know what I saw, and I know I'll never forget the sound of those voices or the way those figures moved. I haven't been back to the woods since. My name is Claire Weston, and I'm 34 years old. What I'm about to share happened last spring during a solo camping trip in Yellowwood State Forest, Indiana. I had always loved the wilderness. Its quiet offered a reprieve from the chaos of the world. But this trip wasn't just about nature. It was research for an article I was writing on the Yellowwood Witch, a local legend that had intrigued me ever since I stumbled upon it online. Back then, I thought it was just a story, something people made up to scare hikers and spice up their campfire tales. I'm not so sure anymore. I arrived at Yellowwood on a crisp Friday afternoon, the late spring air still cool from the morning fog. My RV was packed with everything I'd need for the weekend: camping gear, a notepad for my research, and my camera. I parked at a secluded spot near a trailhead and spent the first few hours setting up camp and going over the details of the legend. The story went that in 1887, a local healer named Eliza Green was accused of witchcraft after several children in the area fell mysteriously ill. The townsfolk blamed her and, without a trial, dragged her into the forest and hanged her from a massive sycamore. They buried her body nearby, but ever since, strange things had been reported in the woods: whispers in the trees, symbols appearing overnight, and hikers who vanished without a trace. Intrigued and eager to explore, I decided to hike to some of the sites associated with the legend. My GPS struggled to connect, so I relied on a printed map. The trails were poorly marked, and I got turned around a couple of times, but by late afternoon I found what I believed to be the old sycamore. Its trunk was massive, gnarled, and scarred with carvings that looked ancient. That's when I noticed the first strange thing: stick figures hanging from the branches. They were crudely made, tied together with twine, and swayed slightly in the breeze. At first, I thought it was some kind of art installation or a prank. I took a few photos, feeling a twinge of unease, and made my way back to camp. By the time I returned, the sun was sinking low, and the temperature had dropped. I built a small fire, cooked a simple meal, and tried to relax. But something felt off. The forest was too quiet, like it was holding its breath. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive silence that pressed against my ears. As night fell, a thick fog rolled in, wrapping around the trees and blurring the edges of the clearing. I was sitting by the fire jotting notes in my notepad when I heard it. "Claire?" The voice was faint, like a whisper carried on the wind. I froze, my pen hovering above the page. I told myself it was just my imagination, but then it came again, clearer this time. "Claire, come here." I stood, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" There was no answer, just the crackle of the fire and the dense fog swallowing the edges of my vision. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe the wind in the trees, or the remnants of some animal call distorted by the forest. But deep down, I knew better. I shook off the unease and decided to call it a night. After extinguishing the fire, I climbed into the RV and locked the door. I left the blinds open, thinking it would help me feel less isolated. But as I lay in bed, I found myself staring into the dark forest, half expecting to see something watching me. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I woke up, it was pitch black. The air inside the RV felt heavy, stifling, and for a moment I couldn't figure out why I was awake. Then I heard it. A faint tapping on the window. I sat up, my heart racing. The sound was soft, deliberate, like someone running their fingers along the glass. I grabbed my flashlight and hesitated, my mind racing through every logical explanation. Branches, an animal, maybe even a prankster. But when I shined the light on the window, there was nothing there. Just the fog outside, thicker than before. I was about to settle back down when I noticed something else. My notepad, which I'd left by the fire, was sitting on the RV's counter. I was sure I hadn't brought it inside. I approached it cautiously, flipping through the pages. My notes were still there, but on the last page, someone, or something, had scrawled a message in jagged handwriting. "Leave." My blood ran cold. I had no idea how it got there or who could have written it. The RV had been locked, and I hadn't seen another person all day. I shoved the notebook into a drawer, trying to shake the growing sense of dread. Sleep was out of the question, so I stayed up the rest of the night, clutching my flashlight and listening to every creak and rustle. The next morning, I decided to cut my trip short. As much as I wanted to finish my research, something about the forest felt wrong, like it was pushing me out. I packed up quickly and planned to hike back to the sycamore to leave an offering, a small token of respect, hoping it might appease whatever force I'd disturbed. The hike was uneventful until I reached the clearing. That's when I saw the cabin. It hadn't been there the day before. It was small, made of weathered stone, with a sagging roof and vines crawling up the walls. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached cautiously, my camera ready. The door creaked open at my touch, revealing a dark, musty interior. Inside, I found a table covered in dried herbs, an old mortar and pestle, and a stack of papers so brittle they crumbled at the edges. Among them was a journal. Its leather cover was cracked, and the pages were filled with spidery handwriting. The entries told the story of Eliza Green, the healer turned witch. She wrote about her work with herbs, the children she tried to save, and the accusations that led to her death. But the last entry was the most chilling. It described a ritual she performed as the mob came for her. A curse to protect the forest and punish those who trespassed with ill intent. As I read, the air grew colder, and the faint scent of smoke filled the cabin. I turned, and there she was, Eliza. Her figure was gaunt and translucent, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. She didn't speak, but I felt her presence as if it were pressing down on my chest. She raised a hand and pointed at me, then toward the door. I didn't need a second warning. I bolted out of the cabin and ran, her whispered words echoing in my ears. "Leave before the forest takes you too." By the time I reached my RV, the fog had thickened again, and the forest seemed alive with movement. Shadows flitted between the trees, and I heard the faint sound of footsteps circling the clearing. I locked the doors and sat in the driver's seat, gripping the wheel as if it could protect me. The tapping on the windows started again, this time more insistent. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the area, but the light only seemed to deepen the shadows. Then I saw them. Figures moving through the fog, their forms shifting and indistinct. They surrounded the RV, their faces twisted in expressions of anger and pain. I don't know how long it lasted. Minutes? Hours? But just when I thought they would break through, Eliza's figure appeared among them. She raised her hands, and glowing symbols lit up the ground around the RV. The figures screamed and retreated, melting into the fog. When dawn broke, the forest was silent again. I left Yellowwood that morning and never looked back. I still don't know if what I saw was real or some elaborate trick of my mind. But I do know this. When I got home, I found a new carving on my RV door, a protective symbol like the ones Eliza used. I wrote my article, but I left out the personal details. Some stories are better left untold. My name is Mark Thorne. I'm 38 years old, and I used to think of myself as a rational person. Skeptic, even. Supernatural stories, ghosts, monsters. I thought they were all just distractions people cooked up to explain the unexplainable. But what happened to me last winter in Morgan Monroe State Forest? I don't know how else to describe it. This isn't an exaggeration or a tall tale. This is exactly how it happened. It was early February, right after the worst of the storms had passed, but before the spring thaw. I'd been living on the road in my old RV for a little over a year by then, driving aimlessly through the Midwest and taking photos along the way. I wasn't exactly chasing anything, more like running. After losing my wife and son in a car accident, staying in one place felt unbearable. That winter, I found myself drawn to Morgan Monroe State Forest in Indiana. I'd read about its abandoned hunting cabins and thought they'd make for a compelling photography project. There was something about the isolation of the forest that appealed to me, like it might match the way I'd been feeling inside. I planned to spend 2 nights camping there, maybe 3 if the photos turned out good. The RV was stocked with supplies, and the weather forecast promised light snow at most. Nothing I couldn't handle. The first day went smoothly. I parked in a small clearing near a trailhead, a good spot to set up camp. The forest was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like the trees are holding their breath. I spent most of the day hiking and taking pictures, finding traces of the past scattered through the woods, old tree stands, rusted traps, the remnants of what might have been a cabin foundation. The uneasiness started that evening. I'd just returned to the RV after sunset, the temperature dropping fast. The first thing I noticed was the tracks, deep claw marks gouged into a tree near the clearing. They were too high up to be from a coyote or bobcat and far too wide. I snapped a picture and tried to shrug it off. Nature's weird sometimes, right? But then, as I cooked dinner, I realized the forest had gone completely silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, no animals. Just the faint crackle of the RV's stove and the sound of my own breathing. I told myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I heard the first scream. It started faint, barely audible over the hum of the RV's heater. At first, I thought it was a bird, or maybe some kind of animal call. But it came again, louder this time, long and shrill like a woman's scream echoing through the trees. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. It didn't sound natural. There was something about it that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The cold bit into my skin as I scanned the forest. The scream came again, this time farther away, almost like it was retreating. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling despite myself. "Is someone out there?" No answer, just silence. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I decided to hike deeper into the forest, hoping to find one of the cabins I'd read about. The trail was harder to follow with the snow, and I got turned around more than once. By late afternoon, I stumbled upon it, a dilapidated hunting cabin hidden behind a thick grove of pines. The roof sagged under the weight of snow, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. Inside, the air was stale and frigid. The walls were covered in crude carvings, antlers, strange symbols, and words scratched deep into the wood. One phrase stood out, repeated over and over. "The hunger never ends." On the floor, I found the remains of an old journal. The pages were brittle, but I could still make out some of the entries. They told the story of a hunter who'd stayed in the cabin one winter, only to be stalked by something he described as a shadow with teeth. He wrote about hearing screams in the night, finding animals killed but uneaten, and feeling a constant, gnawing hunger that wasn't his own. I should have left right then, but curiosity got the better of me. I took photos of the cabin and the journal, feeling more uneasy with every shot. As I turned to leave, I noticed something in the snow outside. Footprints. They were large, misshapen, and didn't look human. They led away from the cabin, disappearing into the dense forest. By the time I got back to the RV, the sun was setting, and the snow was falling harder. The heater was struggling to keep up, and my flashlight batteries were almost dead. I told myself I'd leave in the morning, but deep down, I wasn't sure I'd make it through the night. Around midnight, the screams started again. Louder this time, closer. They echoed through the trees, bouncing off the RV's metal walls. I sat in the driver's seat, clutching a flashlight and my old hunting knife, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. But then I heard it. A faint tapping on the windows. I turned off the flashlight and held my breath, my pulse pounding in my ears. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, moving from window to window as if something was circling the RV. I peered out into the darkness, and that's when I saw it. A gaunt figure stood just beyond the clearing, its elongated limbs blending into the shadows. Its eyes glowed faintly, and antlers jutted from its head like the twisted branches of a dead tree. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stared at me with a hunger I could feel in my bones. I fumbled for the journal I'd taken from the cabin, desperate for answers. One of the last entries mentioned a bundle of dried herbs the hunter had used to ward off the creature. I searched through my supplies, hoping for anything that might work. My hands shook as I lit a bundle of sage and tossed it into the RV's portable stove. The air filled with thick, acrid smoke. The tapping stopped. When I looked outside again, the figure was gone. I didn't wait for morning. I packed up and started driving, the snowstorm making the narrow forest roads even more treacherous. The wendigo, or whatever it was, didn't give up easily. I saw it in the rearview mirror, running alongside the RV, its limbs moving unnaturally fast. It slammed against the side of the vehicle, its claws screeching across the metal. I floored the gas, narrowly avoiding a skid as the creature fell behind. By the time I reached the highway, it was gone. I never went back to Morgan Monroe. The photos I took of the cabin and the journal sit in a folder on my laptop, untouched. Sometimes I think about deleting them, but some part of me wants to remember. Not because I want to relive it, but because I need to remind myself it was real. That hunger? It wasn't just the creatures, it was mine too, and I'm not sure I'll ever feel full again. My name is Alex Taylor, and I'm 28 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened just a few months ago, during a camping trip to Morgan Monroe State Forest in Indiana. At first, it was meant to be a peaceful getaway, a chance for me to reconnect with my best friend Josh after years of drifting apart. Instead, it became something I still have nightmares about, something I might never fully recover from. It started innocently enough. Josh had always been the adventurous one, and when I suggested the trip, he jumped at the chance. I figured the forest would be perfect for hiking, taking some photos and just catching up like we used to in college. I had no idea how much I needed this until I saw his face light up when we met in the parking lot. "Man, it's been too long." Josh clapped me on the back, his grin infectious. He was 29, rugged and confident, the kind of guy who seemed like he could take on the world with just a pocket knife. I envied that about him. We loaded up our packs and set off down the trail, our banter easy, though a little stiff at first. By the time we reached the clearing where we planned to set up camp, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. The forest around us was alive with sound, chirping crickets, the rustle of leaves in the wind, but there was something else too. A stillness that felt off. I chalked it up to being out of my element. "Hey, check this out," Josh said, pulling me toward a tree. Carved into the bark was a strange symbol, an emaciated figure with elongated limbs and hollow eyes. It gave me chills. "Looks like someone's idea of a prank," I said, but my voice wavered. Josh didn't seem bothered. That night, we built a fire and sat under the stars, talking about old times. It felt good, even if the tension from earlier lingered beneath the surface. Around midnight, just as we were about to turn in, it happened. A scream. It was high-pitched, human, but not quite right, like a cry twisted in agony. The sound sent shivers down my spine. Josh glanced at me, his jaw set. "Probably just a fox. They can sound weird at night." I nodded, but deep down, I wasn't convinced. The next day, we decided to hike deeper into the forest. Josh wanted to explore, and I wanted to capture the scenery with my camera. That's when we found the first deer carcass. It was torn open, its ribs jutting out like broken branches. Flies buzzed around the gaping wound, and the stench was unbearable. But what struck me most was the way the body was positioned, in a perfect circle with other bones and antlers. Josh knelt down, inspecting the scene. "What the hell does this?" he muttered. I didn't answer. I was too busy looking at the claw marks gouged into the nearby trees. They were deep, too deep to have been made by any normal animal. As we pressed on, the forest seemed to close in around us. The air grew colder, the trees more twisted and gnarled. Josh's GPS started glitching, showing us in the middle of a lake when we were clearly on dry land. "Stupid thing," Josh grumbled, smacking it against his palm. "Maybe we should head back," I suggested. He gave me a look. "We're fine. Don't tell me you're scared." I didn't respond, but the truth was, I was. By the time we found the cabin, the sky was darkening again. It was small and decrepit, covered in moss and barely standing. I didn't want to go inside, but Josh insisted. The interior was worse. Scratched walls, overturned furniture, and a smell of decay. On a table we found a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. Josh flipped through it, his brow furrowing. "Listen to this," he said, reading aloud. "The devouring spirit comes when the air grows thin. It hungers for those who enter its domain. Fire is the only way to drive it away." "That's comforting," I muttered, trying to lighten the mood. But my stomach churned as Josh turned the journal toward me. The last page was filled with drawings of the same emaciated figure we'd seen carved into the trees. That night, the scream came again, closer this time. I woke in a cold sweat, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Josh was already sitting up, holding a flashlight. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, too terrified to speak. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching the leaves outside our tent. Josh grabbed a hatchet from his pack and motioned for me to stay quiet. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. The footsteps stopped. "Whatever it is, it's gone," Josh said, though his voice didn't sound convinced. But it wasn't gone. The next morning, we found more symbols carved into the trees, all pointing toward the cabin. We followed them, though every step felt heavier, like the forest itself was trying to keep us there. Then I saw it. A figure at the edge of the clearing, tall and skeletal, with glowing, hollow eyes. It didn't move, just watched us. "Josh," I whispered, tugging on his sleeve. He turned and froze. "What the—" Before he could finish, the thing let out a guttural growl and disappeared into the trees. We ran. It didn't matter where, all I cared about was getting away. But no matter how far we went, we kept ending up back at the clearing. Josh's confidence was gone. He looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. "What do we do?" I thought of the journal. "Fire!" It said, "Fire can drive it away." We spent the next hour gathering wood, our hands trembling. Josh used the gasoline from his emergency stash to soak the pile. When the creature appeared again, it didn't attack immediately. It circled us, its hollow eyes glinting in the firelight. I could feel its hunger, its malice. "Stay back!" Josh yelled, brandishing a torch. The creature lunged, and he swung, the flames catching its arm. It let out a screech that rattled my bones, but it didn't stop. In the chaos, Josh went down, its claws raking across his leg. I grabbed the torch and swung wildly, driving the creature back. In the end, it was desperation that saved us. I lured it toward the hollow tree where Josh had doused the inside with gasoline. As it reached for me, I lit a match and tossed it in. The flames roared to life, engulfing the tree and the creature inside. It screamed again, a sound that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Then it was gone. We stumbled back to the RV, battered and bloody. Josh's leg was a mess, and I wasn't sure he'd ever walk the same again. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. There, at the edge of the forest, was a figure with glowing eyes, watching us leave. We survived, but something tells me we weren't meant to. My name is Jordan Ellis. I'm 32 years old, and I'm a travel journalist. That's just a fancy way of saying I roam around the country in my RV, writing about forgotten places and local folklore. What happened to me in Shade State Park still feels like a fever dream, but I know it was real. I have the scars and the nightmares to prove it. It was early autumn when I arrived at Shades. The air was crisp, and the trees had just started turning their brilliant shades of orange and red. It was the kind of place that begged for exploration. I was there to chase a story about an area locals called the Devil's Playground, a remote part of the park infamous for disappearances. The name alone had intrigued me, but the accounts I'd read online sealed the deal. Hikers going missing, strange symbols found carved into trees, and rumors of devil worshipping. It was perfect material for a feature. I parked my RV at the far edge of the campgrounds where the trails were less crowded. The nearest camper was at least 100 yards away, which suited me just fine. I preferred solitude when I worked. The first person I met was Eleanor Grayson, or Ellie, as she introduced herself. She was a wiry woman in her 70s with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. I'd just locked up my RV and was heading toward the main trail when she appeared, almost out of nowhere, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. "You don't want to be out here alone," she said, her voice gravelly. "Excuse me?" I asked, startled. She pointed the cane toward the forest. "The playground. You don't want to go poking around where you're not welcome." "Why's that?" I asked, intrigued. Ellie didn't answer right away. She just looked at me, her expression a mix of pity and something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe. Finally, she said, "Because the forest doesn't like trespassers." Then she turned and walked away, leaving me standing there like an idiot. Ignoring Ellie's warning, I hiked toward the area marked on my map. The trails started out well-trodden, but as I veered off onto less popular paths, the forest seemed to change. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead, blocking out the sunlight. The air felt heavy, and I noticed an odd silence. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of my boots on the dirt. About an hour in, I stumbled upon the first strange sign, a cluster of trees with their bark carved into strange symbols. They were intricate, almost artistic, but there was something unsettling about them. I snapped a few photos with my camera and made a mental note to research the symbols later. By the time I found the clearing, the sun was starting to dip. The grass in the middle was scorched black, forming a perfect circle about 15 feet across. At its center was a charred effigy, a crude figure made of wood and rope, shaped like a goat. I felt a chill run down my spine. This was the stuff of nightmares. I circled the effigy, taking pictures from every angle when I heard it. A soft, childlike laugh coming from the trees. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. That night, back in my RV, I tried to shake off the unease. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I'd let the creepy setting get to me. But when I reviewed the photos, my heart dropped. In several of the shots, there was a shadowy figure standing just at the edge of the frame. It was too blurry to make out details, but it didn't look human. Its limbs were too long, its head too narrow. I told myself it had to be a trick of the light. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of laughter. It was faint, but unmistakable. I sat up, every nerve in my body on edge. The laughter came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of tiny footsteps circling the RV. My heart raced as I grabbed the flashlight from the table and crept to the window. Fog had rolled in, clinging to the ground like a thick, ghostly blanket. In the haze, I saw small handprints smudged across the windows, as though a child had been pressing their palms against the glass. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The laughter came again, louder now, and I swore it was coming from inside the RV. The next morning, I met Tyler and Mia, a young couple who were hiking through the park. They were friendly, if a little naive, and laughed off my story about the laughter and handprints. "Probably just some local kids messing with you," Tyler said with a grin. "Or maybe you're letting the legends get to your head," Mia added. But when I showed them the photos on my camera, their smiles faded. "That's weird," Tyler admitted, his brow furrowed. Mia looked uneasy. "Let's just stick to the main trails, okay?" They left soon after, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd never see them again. Determined to find answers, I hiked back to the clearing that afternoon. The forest felt even heavier this time, the silence almost suffocating. I'd brought a notebook and pen to sketch the symbols I'd seen on the trees, but as I got closer, the air grew colder. When I reached the clearing, the effigy was gone. The scorched circle was still there, but the figure had been replaced by a pile of bones. Animal, from the looks of it. But the bones had been arranged into the same goat-like shape. As I crouched to examine them, I felt a presence behind me. I turned, and there it was. A shadowy figure, impossibly tall, its head crowned with twisted horns. Its hollow eyes seemed to bore into me, filling my chest with an overwhelming sense of dread. I didn't scream. I couldn't. I ran. I don't know how long I ran or how far, but when I finally stopped, gasping for air, I realized I was completely lost. My GPS was useless, the screen flashing erratically, and my phone had no signal. Worse, the forest seemed to shift around me. No matter which direction I went, I ended up back at the clearing. As night fell, I resigned myself to staying in the forest. I built a small fire and sat with my back to a tree, clutching my flashlight like it was a weapon. That's when I remembered Ellie's warning. "The forest doesn't like trespassers," she'd said. The laughter returned, echoing through the trees. And then I saw them. Small, shadowy figures darting between the trunks, their eyes glowing faintly. They were children, or at least, they looked like children. But their movements were jerky, unnatural, like puppets being yanked on strings. I closed my eyes and tried to block them out. Desperation drove me back to the scorched circle. I remembered the journal I'd found in the park's archives earlier that week, the one that mentioned the failed cult ritual. The text had said something about fire disrupting the entity's connection to the forest. Using my camera tripod and some branches, I built a crude effigy in the clearing. Then I set it alight with the last of my lighter fluid. The flames roared to life, casting long shadows across the trees. The laughter turned to screams, high-pitched, inhuman wails that seemed to come from all directions. The shadowy figure appeared again, taller than before, its horns illuminated by the firelight. It reached for me, but as the flames grew, it let out an unearthly howl and vanished into the darkness. I don't remember getting back to my RV. When I came to, the sun was rising, and the forest was still and quiet. I drove away as fast as I could, not stopping until I was miles from Shade State Park. But even now, I can't escape it. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear the faint sound of laughter outside my window, and I see tiny handprints on the glass. My name is Rebecca Lawson, but most people just call me Becca. I'm 27 years old, and I'm a freelance wildlife photographer. My job has taken me to some of the most breathtaking places in the country, but it's also led me into situations I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. What happened to me in the Hoosier National Forest was one of those times. It started as a professional opportunity. I'd read a blog about a hidden glade in the forest, supposedly untouched by humans, with legends of ancient burial grounds nearby. The photos from the post were stunning, but the writer had only captured glimpses of the area. They'd hinted at something unsettling but hadn't gone into detail. To me, it sounded like the perfect mix of mystery and beauty to land a feature in Wilderness Weekly. I packed my RV with supplies and drove out to Hoosier National Forest. I knew the trip would be challenging. Unmarked trails and dense woods were always tricky, but I wasn't prepared for what I'd face. I arrived late in the afternoon and parked at a quiet campsite far from the main entrance. I liked to work in solitude. Distractions from other campers or noisy families made it hard to focus. As I set up my gear, a man approached me. "Lost?" he asked, his voice gruff. I turned to see a park ranger, his uniform a little worn and his face weathered like he'd spent years out in the elements. "No, I'm fine," I said, trying to sound confident. The ranger squinted at me. "Name's Caleb Turner. You heading into the woods?" "Yeah, I'm a photographer. Heard about a glade somewhere off the trails. Thought I'd check it out." Caleb's face darkened. "If you're smart, you'll stick to the official paths." I frowned. "Why's that?" "There's a part of this forest folks call the Silent One's territory. It's not on any map. People who go poking around there don't always come back." "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then said, "Just stay out of the old burial ground. If you find it, turn around. Fast." The next morning, I set out with my camera, a map I'd found online, and my usual gear. I couldn't shake Caleb's warning, but curiosity always got the better of me. Besides, the photos I'd seen in the blog post were too gorgeous to ignore. The forest was alive with the sound of birds and rustling leaves, but the deeper I went, the quieter it became. After about an hour, I noticed strange carvings on the trees, symbols I didn't recognize. They were crude but deliberate, like they'd been made by someone with a purpose. I stopped to snap a few pictures, but my camera started acting up. The screen flickered, and when I tried to review the shots, they were distorted with streaks of static. Annoyed, I tucked it away and kept going. By mid-afternoon, I found the glade. It was beautiful, just as the blog had described. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting golden beams over lush grass. In the middle of the clearing stood a circle of moss-covered stones. I should have left then, but the photographer in me couldn't resist. I approached the stones, noticing how they were arranged in a perfect pattern. They didn't look natural, and the air around them felt heavy. I crouched to get a closer look when I heard it. A whisper, soft and faint, like wind brushing against my ear. I froze. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. That night, I returned to my RV exhausted and unsettled. I couldn't stop thinking about the stones or the whisper I'd heard. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and tried to convince myself it was just the wind. But as I lay in bed, the whispers returned. They weren't outside this time. They were inside. I bolted upright, my flashlight clutched in my hand. The RV was silent, but the windows were fogged with condensation, and on the glass I saw tiny handprints. The next morning, I met another pair of hikers, Tyler and Mia. They were young, carefree, and completely unfazed when I told them about the handprints and whispers. "You probably freaked yourself out," Tyler said with a grin. Mia shrugged. "It's just an old legend, right? The silent ones? Probably something made up to keep kids from wandering too far." But when I showed them the photos of the carvings on the trees, they exchanged uneasy glances. "That's creepy," Mia admitted. Tyler laughed nervously. "Let's stick to the marked trails." They left soon after. I didn't see them again. Determined to get more photos, I returned to the glade that afternoon. This time, something was different. The stones were darker, the moss tinged with black, and there was something else, a faint, metallic smell in the air. As I stood there, the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees loomed taller, their branches intertwining like a cage. I tried to leave, but every path led me back to the glade. That's when I saw them. Figures emerged from the trees, pale and gaunt, their eyes sunken and hollow. They didn't move like normal people. Their limbs were too stiff, their heads tilting unnaturally as they watched me. They were silent, but their presence screamed danger. I tried to run, but the forest wouldn't let me. Trails vanished, landmarks appeared in places they hadn't been before, and the silent ones were always just behind me, moving closer with each passing second. Desperate, I remembered Caleb's warning about the burial ground. "Respect it," he'd said. I dropped to my knees in the center of the glade, my heart pounding. I pulled out my camera, along with my notebook and a small pocket knife. Quickly, I began carving one of the symbols I'd seen into the notebook cover. The silent ones stopped moving. I took the hint and carved more symbols, placing the notebook in the middle of the stones. Then I grabbed my camera and smashed it against a rock, adding the pieces to the offering. The silent ones loomed closer, their hollow eyes fixed on me. One of them reached out, its skeletal hand brushing against my arm. Pain shot through me, searing and unbearable, and then nothing. When I woke, the silent ones were gone. The forest was alive again, birds chirping and leaves rustling in the wind. I limped back to my RV, exhausted and shaken. My camera was gone, along with all my photos, but in my pocket I found a small carved stone etched with one of the symbols. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. At the edge of the forest stood a pale figure, watching me leave. I haven't been back to Hoosier National Forest since, and I don't plan to. Some places aren't meant to be explored. Some stories aren't meant to be told. My name is Naomi Kane, and I'm 27 years old. What I'm about to share isn't a story I tell lightly. It happened 2 years ago in the depths of Yellowwood State Forest, Indiana. I've tried to bury it, tried to convince myself it wasn't real, but the nightmares won't let me forget. We were just a group of friends looking for a weekend adventure. We thought it would be fun. Aiden, our unofficial leader, suggested Yellowwood because he'd heard rumors about an abandoned indigenous settlement deep in the woods. "We can make it a spooky camping trip," he said, his eyes lighting up with excitement. He was 28, full of charm but always chasing adrenaline. Cassie, my best friend, joined for the spiritual aspect. At 26, she was the kind of person who could find beauty in anything, even ghost stories. Then there was Lucas, 29, a quiet and brooding survivalist, and Jared, the 25-year-old jokester who kept everyone laughing. I came along reluctantly, only because Aiden promised it would make for a great blog post. Our base was an old RV that Aiden borrowed from his uncle. It groaned and rattled as we drove into Yellowwood, the thick forest closing in around us. The air felt heavy, like the trees were watching. Cassie commented on it right away. "It's alive," she whispered, her fingers grazing the window as we passed towering oaks. I rolled my eyes, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. We set up camp in a clearing near a dried-up creek. The generator sputtered, coughing out faint light before dying completely. "Guess we're roughing it," Jared joked, but I could tell he wasn't thrilled. Aiden shrugged it off, saying we'd use flashlights and make it authentic. It started subtly, almost too easy to dismiss. Cassie found strange symbols carved into nearby trees, circles with jagged lines cutting through them. "Protective wards," she murmured. Aiden laughed it off. Probably just kids messing around. But as the sun set and darkness enveloped the forest, the air grew colder, sharper. Around midnight, the sounds began. At first, it was just twigs snapping, like small animals moving in the brush. But then came the chanting, low and guttural, too rhythmic to be random. Cassie stiffened, her wide eyes scanning the trees. "Do you hear that?" "Hear what?" Aiden asked, feigning ignorance. "It's chanting," she whispered. Lucas frowned. "That's not animals." We stayed up most of the night, clustered around the fire. Aiden tried to keep the mood light, but even Jared stopped cracking jokes. The chanting faded with the dawn, leaving us exhausted and on edge. The next day, Aiden insisted we explore. He had a map, though it was clearly outdated. "Let's find that settlement," he said, his enthusiasm undeterred. Cassie hesitated. "I don't think we should. The forest feels wrong." But Aiden convinced her, and we set off. It wasn't long before we realized we were lost. The trail disappeared, swallowed by undergrowth. Lucas cursed under his breath, his knife slicing through vines as we pushed deeper. The forest grew darker, the trees towering like silent sentinels. Then we saw it. A crude totem standing in a clearing. It was made of bones and twisted branches with a horned skull perched on top. "What the hell is that?" Jared whispered. "An altar," Cassie said, her voice shaking. "This is sacred ground." Aiden scoffed, but even he looked unnerved. As we stood there, the forest grew deathly silent. No birds, no insects, just an oppressive, eerie quiet. It happened that night. Jared went out to relieve himself but didn't return. Lucas grabbed a flashlight and went to find him. Minutes later, we heard screaming. Lucas came stumbling back, dragging Jared. His leg was torn open, blood soaking his jeans. "There was a trap," Lucas panted. "A tripwire. Poisoned." Jared was delirious, his skin clammy and pale. Cassie tried to clean the wound, but the poison spread quickly. Jared's breathing grew shallow. "We need to get him out of here," I said, my voice rising. "We can't," Lucas snapped. "The RV's miles away and we don't even know which direction to go." Then came the chanting again, louder this time. Shadows moved between the trees, too fast to be human. They attacked without warning. Figures emerged from the darkness. Painted faces, glowing eyes, and crude weapons. One swung a club at Aiden, but Lucas tackled him. I screamed as Cassie pulled me toward the fire, the only barrier between us and them. Jared was dragged away, his screams piercing the night. We couldn't stop them. There were too many. The remaining three of us huddled together, clutching makeshift weapons. "We have to get to the river," Lucas said. "They won't follow us there." "How do you know that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Because they're tied to this place," he said. "It's their territory. The river's the edge of it." As we fled, we stumbled upon another clearing. This one was worse, a massive totem surrounded by bones and rotting flesh. Cassie froze, staring at the grotesque display. "They're worshipping something," she said. "This isn't just survival, this is devotion." Before we could move, Cassie screamed. She was yanked into the darkness, her cries fading into the chanting. Lucas and I ran, guilt eating at us. We reached the river by dawn, our bodies battered and bruised. But the feral folk were relentless. They stood at the edge of the trees, watching, waiting. Lucas turned to me. "Go," he said. "What? No. Just go, I'll hold them off." Before I could protest, he charged back into the forest, a makeshift spear in hand. His screams echoed as I stumbled into the water, letting the current carry me away. I woke up in a hospital 2 days later. Hikers had found me downstream, delirious and dehydrated. The authorities didn't believe my story. They chalked it up to a camping mishap. Jared's body was never found. Neither was Lucas's or Cassie's. The RV was recovered, but it was empty, stripped of supplies. I tried to write about it, to share what happened, but every time I uploaded my story, it disappeared. My blog was hacked, my files corrupted. Someone, or something, doesn't want the world to know what lurks in Yellowwood Forest. But I remember. Every night I hear the chanting, and every morning I wake up knowing I escaped something far worse than death. My name is Ethan Carter, and I'm 34 years old. I'm a photographer by trade, traveling the country in my RV to capture the beauty of the world's hidden places. This story isn't about beauty, though. It's about what happened 2 years ago in Shade State Park, Indiana. I've tried to forget, but the memories cling to me like a shadow. I'd heard about Shades from a fellow traveler who described its rugged trails and picturesque canyons. The park wasn't as crowded as some of the bigger spots, which made it perfect for my work and my introverted nature. It was late October, the height of the fall season. and I was chasing the fiery reds and oranges that blanketed the Midwest. When I arrived, the air was crisp and still. The forest felt untouched, ancient in a way that made me feel like a trespasser. I parked my RV in a remote campsite near the edge of the canyon. It was quiet, with only the occasional rustling of leaves or bird call breaking the silence. "Beautiful, isn't it?" said a voice behind me. I turned to see an older man in a park ranger uniform. His name tag read Hal. He had the kind of weathered face that comes from years of working outdoors. "It is," I replied. Hal gave me a long look. "Be careful near the canyon. Don't stray off the trails, especially after dark. This place has history." "History?" I asked. He hesitated, then shrugged. "Old stories. People getting lost. Strange things happening. Most of it's just nonsense, but I've been here long enough to know there's some truth to it. Stay safe." With that cryptic warning, he left. That first night, as I was sorting through my gear, I heard it. Soft sobbing. I froze, listening. It was faint, but unmistakable, coming from outside. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped out of the RV, the beam slicing through the darkness. "Hello?" I called. No answer, but there were footprints, small, childlike, pressed into the dirt. They led toward the canyon's edge. My heart pounded. "Is someone there?" I asked again, louder this time. The sobbing stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was heavier than before, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. I returned to the RV and locked the door. Maybe it was just an animal, I told myself. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The morning light brought a false sense of security. Determined to shake off the unease, I packed my camera and headed out to explore the canyon. The trails were steep and winding, but the views were worth it. As I ventured deeper, I noticed strange carvings on the rocks, circles, jagged lines, and what looked like a horned figure. They didn't match the Native American petroglyphs I'd seen before. These were cruder, almost violent in their design. Then I saw her. A girl, maybe 10 years old, stood at the edge of a clearing. She wore a tattered dress that looked centuries out of place. Her hair was tangled, and her eyes, too bright, too intense, locked onto mine. "Hey, are you lost?" I called, but she didn't respond. She raised a hand and pointed toward a narrow, overgrown trail. Then, without a word, she turned and disappeared into the trees. I hesitated. Every instinct told me to leave, but curiosity won. I followed the trail, ducking under low-hanging branches until I came to a clearing. There stood an old, abandoned homestead, a crumbling cabin with a collapsed roof and a small graveyard behind it. The graves were marked with rotting wooden crosses, the names weathered away. One grave, smaller than the others, had a crude carving of a flower. A chill ran through me as I realized how out of place it all felt. That night, the whispers began. They were faint at first, like wind through the trees, but they grew louder, surrounding the RV. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate. I sat frozen in my bunk, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. Then came the knock. It was soft, almost hesitant, but it sent a jolt through me. I moved to the window and peered out. There she was, the girl from the clearing, standing just a few feet away. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment I felt an overwhelming sense of sorrow. She raised a hand, pointing again toward the canyon. "Who are you?" I whispered, but she vanished. When I checked my camera the next morning, every photo from the previous day was corrupted. The images were warped, faces and figures emerging from the shadows where there had been none. I drove into town to dig up more information about the area. The local library had an archive of old newspapers, and it didn't take long to find what I was looking for. In the early 1800s, a group of settlers had established a small community near the canyon. They were unprepared for the harsh winter that followed. Supplies ran out, disease spread, and desperation took hold. The records hinted at something darker. Whispers of cannibalism, of rituals to appease a horned deity they believed could save them. By spring, none of the settlers were left. Their bodies were found scattered around a crude altar, their faces frozen in terror. That night, I was determined to put an end to whatever was haunting me. I packed my flashlight, camera, and a notebook, then followed the trail to the clearing. As I approached the cabin, the air grew colder, and the whispers turned to screams. The Wraiths emerged from the shadows, pale, translucent figures with hollow eyes and gaping mouths. They surrounded me, their whispers rising into a cacophony. My flashlight flickered and I felt their icy fingers clawing at my skin. Then I saw her, the girl. She stood by the altar, her expression urgent. She pointed to a wooden chest at its base. I fought through the Wraiths, grabbing the chest and throwing it open. Inside was a journal, its pages filled with frantic scrawls about the settlers' descent into madness. One entry stood out. "The curse will end when the truth is known." I ran, the Wraiths chasing me until I reached the edge of the canyon. The first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, and the spirits dissolved into the mist. Back in my RV, I pored over the journal. It told the full story of the settlers' downfall, their rituals, and their belief in a horned god that demanded sacrifices. I wrote everything down, determined to share it with the world. But when I tried to upload my story, my computer crashed. My files were corrupted, and the journal disappeared from my belongings. Now, every night I hear whispers outside my window. I see shadows flickering in the corners of my vision. I escaped Shade State Park, but I know it hasn't let me go. And if you're reading this, you've been warned. Some truths are better left buried. My name is Delilah Reeves, and I'm 39 years old. I've always thought of myself as strong and independent, but this trip taught me how fragile those illusions can be. It happened 2 months after my divorce, during a solo RV trip to Hoosier National Forest in Indiana. I went there to prove to myself that I didn't need anyone, that I could handle the wild and rediscover who I was. What I found instead has made me question everything I thought I knew about the world. It started on a crisp fall afternoon. The forest was beautiful, a sea of gold and crimson stretching endlessly under a pale blue sky. The campground I chose was remote, exactly what I wanted. No screaming kids, no other campers to remind me of what I'd left behind. It was just me, my RV, and the wilderness. "Welcome to Hoosier Forest," said a cheerful voice. I turned to see a young man in a park staff uniform walking toward me carrying a map. "I'm Tom. You need any help finding the trails?" "Thanks, but I've got it covered," I replied, taking the map he offered. Tom smiled, then pointed to a spot circled in red. "That's the Lost Hollow. Beautiful spot, but easy to get turned around. Stick to the marked trails if you're heading that way. This forest has a way of swallowing people who wander off." "Got it," I said, though I wasn't really listening. Warnings were a part of the job, I figured, meant to scare off reckless tourists. That evening, as I settled into the RV, the forest came alive with the sounds of nature. The rustle of leaves, the chirping of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, almost hypnotic. But around midnight something changed. The usual noises fell silent, replaced by an eerie stillness that pressed against the windows like a living thing. Then came the scratching. It was faint at first, like twigs brushing against the side of the RV. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the darkness. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. Nothing, just the trees standing motionless in the moonlight. I told myself it was probably a raccoon and went back inside, but I locked the door before climbing into bed. The next morning, I set out to explore the trails. The forest was breathtaking in the daylight, the sunlight filtering through the canopy in golden streams. About an hour into my hike, I noticed a narrow, overgrown path branching off from the main trail. It wasn't on the map, but something about it drew me in. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became, until all I could hear was the crunch of leaves under my boots. That's when I saw the cabin. It was old and ramshackle, leaning precariously to one side as if the forest were trying to reclaim it. Smoke curled from the chimney, and a faded curtain shifted in the window. I knocked hesitantly, and the door creaked open. A frail woman with silver hair and piercing eyes stood in the doorway. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice sharp. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude," I stammered. She stared at me for a long moment, then said, "They're watching you, you know. The Watchers. Once they've seen you, they don't stop." My stomach twisted. "What are you talking about?" "You'll see," she said, then slammed the door in my face. I tried to shake off the encounter as I made my way back to the RV, but her words lingered in my mind. That night, as I reviewed the photos I'd taken, I noticed something strange. In one shot, taken near the cabin, there were shadows in the background. Vague, humanoid shapes that hadn't been there when I pressed the shutter. A chill ran through me, but I convinced myself it was a trick of the light. Then came the tapping. It was soft but deliberate, moving from one window to the next. My pulse quickened as I grabbed the flashlight and peered outside. That's when I saw them. They were tall and impossibly thin, with elongated limbs and glowing eyes that reflected the beam of my flashlight like an animal's. They stood just at the edge of the trees, watching. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. The tapping stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. The next day, desperate for answers, I hiked back to the overgrown trail. I needed to know what was happening, and I hoped the old woman could explain. Instead, I found strange symbols carved into the trees, spirals, circles, and jagged lines that seemed to pulse with some unseen energy. The air grew colder the closer I got to the cabin, but when I arrived, it was abandoned. Frustrated and scared, I turned to leave, but stopped when I heard a whisper. It wasn't words, just a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver down my spine. That night, the Watchers came closer. They pressed their long fingers against the RV's windows, their glowing eyes scanning the interior. No matter where I moved, they followed, their heads tilting in unison. I tried to start the RV, but the engine wouldn't turn over. The tires had been shredded, leaving me stranded. Panic set in as the whispers began again, this time inside the RV. I grabbed my flashlight and ran into the forest, the beam cutting through the darkness as I stumbled toward the lost hollow. The Watchers followed, their movements silent but deliberate. No matter how fast I ran, they stayed just behind me, their glowing eyes a constant presence. When I finally reached the lost hollow, I found myself in a clearing surrounded by a circle of ancient stones. The symbols from the trees were etched into their surfaces, glowing faintly in the moonlight. I stepped into the circle and the Watchers stopped. They stood at the edge, their forms flickering like shadows in a storm. One by one, they began to dissolve, their whispers fading into the night. When I woke, it was morning. The forest was quiet, and my RV was parked neatly at the trailhead as if nothing had happened. I left Hoosier National Forest that day, vowing never to return. But the experience has stayed with me. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the tapping again. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I feel their eyes watching me. My name is Jake Davis, and I'm 32 years old. This happened to me 2 years ago, in late October, while I was camping in Hoosier National Forest, Indiana. I was alone out there, and even now, I'm not sure how I made it back. People think I'm lying or exaggerating, but I know what I saw. I'll never forget it. I'm an outdoor enthusiast, the kind of guy who thrives on solitude and wilderness. I just started a blog about camping and survival tips, and this trip was supposed to be my content goldmine. A week off the grid, living out of my RV in the heart of the forest, surrounded by nothing but nature. I wanted to document every detail, the trails, the gear, the peace. I didn't believe in the local legends, and that was my first mistake. I drove into the forest late in the afternoon, taking a route suggested by a fellow camper I met online. It was off the beaten path, far from the popular sites, which was exactly what I wanted. The sun was setting by the time I reached my spot, a clearing surrounded by towering trees that seemed to press in like silent onlookers. While setting up, I noticed a park ranger walking up the trail. She was in her late 20s, with a friendly but cautious demeanor. She introduced herself as Emily Hargrove. We chatted briefly, and I mentioned my plan to explore some of the unmarked trails. Her expression changed immediately. "You really shouldn't wander off the main paths," she said, her voice low. "This forest, it's not always kind to strangers, especially those who don't respect it." I laughed it off, thinking she was just trying to scare me. "I've been doing this for years. I think I'll be fine." She didn't laugh back. "Just stay safe, and if you see anything strange, don't follow it." I waved her off as she walked away, but her warning lingered in the back of my mind. The first night was uneventful, or so I thought. I cooked a quick dinner over the fire, read for a while, and went to bed early. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a faint sound, a distant laugh. It wasn't the joyous kind of laughter you'd hear from a group around a campfire. It was sharp and cold, echoing through the trees. My first thought was that other campers were nearby, but I hadn't seen anyone since I'd arrived. I told myself it was nothing and went back to sleep. The next morning, things started going wrong. My GPS wasn't working. The screen stuck on a blank map. My lantern, which I'd tested before leaving, flickered and died despite having new batteries. When I unpacked my gear, I realized I'd forgotten my backup flashlight. These were small issues on their own, but they added up to an unsettling feeling. Then, I saw the footprints. They were large, barefoot, and too wide to belong to a human. They circled my campfire, stopping inches from my RV door. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I told myself it was probably a bear or some kind of animal, and decided to explore the unmarked trail I'd spotted the day before. It wasn't on the map, but the forest seemed calm in the daylight. I convinced myself that everything had a logical explanation. The trail wound deeper into the forest, the trees growing denser until the sunlight barely filtered through. About an hour in, I stumbled upon something strange. A clearing with an old stone circle, overgrown with moss and roots. The air here felt heavy, like the weight of years pressing down on me. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I wanted photos for my blog, so I stayed. As I snapped pictures, I noticed symbols carved into the stones, symbols I couldn't understand. My camera screen flickered, and when I looked at the images, they were distorted, as though something had blurred the lens. That's when I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I turned quickly, scanning the trees. At first, I saw nothing. Then a movement, too fast to track. A figure darted between the trees, barely visible but unmistakably humanoid. My heart raced. I called out, "Hello? Who's there?" No response, just the sound of leaves rustling. Then I saw them. 3 figures standing in the shadows. They were tall, unnaturally thin, with pale, smooth skin that seemed to reflect the dim light. Their eyes glinted like mirrors and their heads tilted as if studying me. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They just watched. I backed away, heart pounding. My first thought was to run, but something told me not to turn my back. I kept my eyes on them as I retraced my steps, the figures shifting slightly but never fully disappearing from view. When I finally reached my RV, I locked the door and drew the blinds. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was a group of hikers playing a prank or some kind of optical illusion. But deep down, I knew better. That night, the sounds returned. Whispers, faint footsteps, and a soft tapping on the RV's windows. I didn't sleep. The next morning, Emily appeared at my campsite. She took one look at me and knew something was wrong. I told her about the figures and the stone circle, expecting her to laugh. Instead, her face went pale. "You saw them," she whispered. "Who?" "What are they?" I asked. "They're called the Shadow Walkers. They're not people. They mimic human behavior, but they're something else. The legend says they're spirits of settlers who desecrated an indigenous burial ground. They were cursed to wander these woods forever." I stared at her, unable to process what she was saying. "How do I get rid of them?" "You can't," she said, "but you can avoid them. Don't make noise, don't look them in the eyes, and don't follow them if they try to lead you away." That night was the worst. The shadow walkers surrounded my RV, their faces pressed against the windows. They didn't knock or try to get in. They just stared, their reflective eyes following me as I moved inside. I tried to stay calm, but the fear was suffocating. I turned on every light, hoping it would deter them, but it only seemed to agitate them. Their tapping grew louder, more insistent. One of them began scraping its nails down the side of the RV, leaving deep gouges in the metal. Around midnight, they started mimicking my voice, calling out in a perfect imitation of my own tone. "Help me, please, let me in." At dawn, the noises stopped. I packed up as quickly as I could and drove out of there, not stopping until I reached the ranger station at the edge of the forest. Emily was there waiting. "They don't like the daylight," she said. "You're lucky to be alive." I didn't feel lucky. My RV was damaged, my camera footage was corrupted, and my sense of safety was gone. I left Hoosier National Forest that day and never went back. I still don't know what they wanted or why they let me go. Sometimes I dream about the forest, about the shadow walkers standing just outside my window. People ask why I stopped camping, why I gave up the blog. I just tell them I lost interest. But the truth is, I know they're still out there, waiting for someone else to wander too far, and I'm never going back. My name is Daniel Harper, and I'm 45 years old. What I'm about to share happened last fall when I took a solo RV trip to Shade State Park in Indiana. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, a break from my messy divorce and the suffocating routine of city life. Instead, it became a nightmare I can't escape, even now. I'd heard about Shade State Park from a colleague who described it as a hidden gem. The rugged trails, deep ravines, and thick forests sounded like the perfect place to clear my head. I wanted isolation. No distractions, no reminders of my past life. But I wasn't prepared for what I found there. I pulled my RV into the park just before sunset, choosing a secluded site near the Devil's Punch Bowl. The name intrigued me, and the ranger at the entrance hadn't seemed concerned when I mentioned it. "Just a bit of folklore," she'd said with a shrug. That was fine by me. I wasn't here for ghost stories. I was here for peace. The campsite was everything I'd hoped for. Quiet, surrounded by towering trees and far from the main trails. I parked, set up my little folding table and chair, and cooked a simple dinner on the portable stove. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt the tension of the past months start to lift. Then, just as I was finishing my meal, I heard it. A faint, high-pitched whistle. At first, I thought it might be the wind or some kind of bird. It wasn't a tune exactly, but it had a rhythm, like a melody just out of reach. I shrugged it off and went to bed early, eager to start exploring the trails the next morning. The first night, I slept restlessly. The whistle came and went, faint but persistent, like it was circling my RV. I told myself it was nothing. The wind through the trees, I thought. Or maybe a distant camper playing a flute or harmonica. But the next morning, when I stepped outside, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. There were small handprints in the dirt around my RV, as though a child had been playing there. They were too small to be an adult's and oddly narrow, with elongated fingers. I tried to reason it away. Maybe someone had wandered through my sight. It wasn't unheard of, but deep down, it unsettled me. That afternoon, I decided to hike the Devil's Punch Bowl Trail. It was a steep, rocky path leading down into a shadowy ravine. The air grew cooler as I descended, the trees so dense that daylight barely penetrated the canopy. I was alone, or so I thought. About halfway down, I saw someone sitting on a boulder ahead. She looked to be in her late 20s, with short auburn hair and a weathered backpack. She waved as I approached. "Nice day for a hike," she said, smiling. "Yeah, it is," I replied, though something about her put me on edge. She introduced herself as Ellie Brooks and said she was also camping solo. We fell into an easy conversation, and I found myself relaxing a little. She seemed confident and knowledgeable about the area, pointing out landmarks and warning me about slippery sections of the trail. Then, as we reached the bottom of the ravine, Ellie stopped and turned to me. "Have you heard about the Whistler?" she asked. I shook my head. "No. What's that?" She hesitated, her smile fading. "It's a story locals tell about this park. They say there's something in the woods that whistles. A creature, or maybe a spirit. It mimics voices and lures people away from the trails. If you follow the sound, you don't come back." I chuckled nervously. "Sounds like something out of a campfire story." Ellie didn't laugh. "Maybe, but I wouldn't take any chances if I were you." That evening, back at my campsite, I couldn't stop thinking about Ellie's story. The whistle had been so faint the night before, but now I couldn't unhear it. As the sun set and the forest grew dark, the melody returned, soft at first, then louder, more distinct. I sat by the fire trying to ignore it, but when it began to circle my sight, moving from one side of the RV to the other, I couldn't pretend anymore. My heart raced. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam across the trees, but there was nothing there. Then I heard it, my ex-wife's voice. "Daniel," it called, soft and familiar. "Come here." I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand. It wasn't possible. She was hundreds of miles away, and yet her voice came again, closer this time. "Daniel, I need you." Against my better judgment, I took a step toward the sound. Then another. The whistle resumed, blending with her voice in an eerie harmony. I was halfway to the tree line before I realized what I was doing. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back to the RV, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I found scratches on the RV's windows, long, thin gouges like claws. My supplies, which I'd left on the picnic table, were scattered across the ground. I wanted to believe it was a raccoon or some other animal, but the handprints were back, fresh and impossibly small. Ellie showed up at my sight just as I was cleaning up. She looked pale, her usual cheerfulness gone. "You heard it, didn't you?" she asked. I nodded, too shaken to deny it. "I told you to leave," she said. "The longer you stay, the stronger it gets." "Why are you still here then?" I shot back, more harshly than I intended. Ellie didn't answer. She just looked at me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't read. Pity, maybe, or fear. That night, the whistle returned, louder than ever. It didn't circle this time. It came straight for the RV, growing impossibly loud, as if the source was right outside. I peeked through the blinds and my breath caught. There, at the edge of the firelight, was a figure. It was tall and thin, with elongated limbs and hollow eyes that glinted in the dark. Its mouth was open, stretched unnaturally wide, and the whistle poured from it like a song. I stumbled back, heart pounding. The figure didn't move, but its shadow stretched toward the RV, long and distorted. Then I heard my own voice, calling from the woods. "Help me," it said. "Please, help me." I grabbed my flashlight and knife, determined to confront whatever was out there. But as I stepped outside, Ellie appeared again, seemingly out of nowhere. "You can't fight it," she said, her voice urgent. "It feeds on fear. If you react, it wins." "How do you know so much about it?" I demanded, suspicion creeping into my voice. Ellie hesitated, then sighed. "Because I've been here before. I made the mistake of following the whistle, and now I can't leave." "What do you mean, you can't leave?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped into the shadows and vanished. I didn't sleep that night. The whistling continued, relentless and haunting. By dawn, I'd had enough. I packed up the RV and drove straight to the park entrance, barely stopping to check the map. When I reached the ranger station, the woman behind the desk looked surprised to see me. "Back so soon?" she asked. I told her about the whistler and about Ellie. Her expression turned somber. "No one named Ellie Brooks is registered here," she said. "And you're not the first person to mention the whistling. It's been part of this park's folklore for decades." I left without another word, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they ached. I sold the RV a week later. Camping isn't for me anymore, not after what I experienced. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that melody, a faint, haunting whistle that seems to come from nowhere. I don't know what the whistler is or if Ellie was real, but I do know one thing. Something waits in the shadows of Shade State Park, and it doesn't want you to leave. My name is Sarah Connors, and I'm 37 years old. I'm a travel photographer, the kind of person who thrives on solitude and adventure. This story happened last October, when I took an assignment to photograph the fall foliage at Brown County State Park in Indiana. I thought it would be a simple trip, just me, my RV, and the beauty of nature. I was wrong. The drive into Brown County State Park was stunning. The hills were ablaze with autumn colors, and the historic covered bridges looked like something out of a postcard. I felt a flicker of excitement for the first time in weeks. Work had been slow, and I needed this assignment to remind me why I loved what I did. Before heading into the park, I stopped at a small bait and tackle shop near the entrance to grab some snacks and a map. The shop was cluttered and smelled of wood smoke, but it had a certain charm. The owner, Greg, was a wiry man in his 50s with a weathered face and an easy smile. "You camping in the park?" he asked as he rang up my items. "Yeah, I've got my RV, hoping to get some good shots of the leaves before the season's over." He nodded, but his smile faded slightly. "You planning to stick to the main campgrounds?" "No, I found a spot online that's a little more remote. I prefer the quiet." Greg's expression darkened. "Be careful out there. Some of those old trails, Well, they're not all safe. You ever hear of the Lantern Man? I raised an eyebrow. The Lantern Man? Old legend around here, Greg said, leaning on the counter. They say there's a ghost in the woods, carries a lantern and lures people off the trail. Folks who follow the light never come back. I chuckled nervously. Sounds like a good Halloween story. Maybe, he said, his voice low. But a lot of people have gone missing in these woods over the years. I thanked him and left, brushing off his warning. I didn't have time for ghost stories. My campsite was perfect, a secluded spot near the park's older trails, with a breathtaking view of the valley. I set up my RV, unpacked my camera gear, and spent the afternoon scouting locations. The light filtering through the golden leaves was incredible, and I knew I'd get some amazing shots. As night fell, the forest grew eerily quiet. I sat by the fire listening to the crackle of the wood and the occasional rustle of leaves. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. That's when I saw it. A faint light flickering in the distance just beyond the tree line. It wasn't a fire or a flashlight. It had a warm, golden glow, like an old-fashioned lantern. At first, I thought it might be another camper, but it seemed to move strangely, floating in and out of view. I called out, but there was no response. After a few minutes, the light disappeared, leaving me alone in the darkness. The next morning, I found something strange near my campsite, an old, rusted lantern hanging from a low branch. It looked like it had been there for years, but there was no sign of anyone else around. I took a picture of it, thinking it might make an interesting addition to my portfolio, and moved it aside. As the day went on, I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. I hiked a few of the older trails, capturing the vibrant colors of the forest. But every so often I'd catch glimpses of that flickering light through the trees. It was always far away, always just out of reach. That night, the whistling started. I was sitting in the RV, reviewing the day's photos, when I heard it. A faint, melodic whistle. It came from somewhere in the woods, soft and slow, rising and falling like a song carried on the wind. I froze, every instinct telling me to stay inside. But the whistle grew louder, more insistent, and curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The light was back, flickering in the distance. It moved slowly, as if beckoning me to follow. I hesitated, remembering Greg's warning, but the whistle was hypnotic. I took a few steps toward the light, then stopped. Something wasn't right. The whistling wasn't coming from the light. It was behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there, just the dark, empty forest. The whistle faded, and the light vanished. Shaking, I hurried back into the RV and locked the door. The next day, I met Greg again at the bait shop. I told him about the light and the whistle, half expecting him to laugh. Instead, he looked genuinely alarmed. "You need to leave," he said firmly. "That's the Lantern Man. You follow him, you're done for." "I don't believe in ghosts," I said, trying to sound confident. Greg leaned closer, his voice low. "You don't have to believe. Just stay away from that light." That night, the Lantern Man came closer. I was in bed when I heard it. A soft knock on the RV door. I froze, holding my breath as the knock came again. Slowly, I peeked through the window. There he was. The figure stood just outside, holding a lantern that glowed with an unnatural light. His face was hollow, flickering like a flame. He didn't move, just stood there, the light swaying gently in the dark. I backed away, heart racing. The whistle began again, louder and more melodic, filling the RV with its haunting tune. I tried to block it out, but it was inside my head, pulling at me, urging me to open the door. I grabbed my camera, desperate to document what was happening. But when I looked through the lens, the figure wasn't there. Only the lantern's glow remained, floating in the air like a will-o'-the-wisp. Suddenly, the RV shook violently as if something was pounding on the walls. I screamed, fumbling for my keys, and started the engine. The whistle turned into a deafening roar as I tore out of the campsite, not daring to look back. I drove straight through the night, stopping only when I reached the park entrance. My hands were trembling as I stumbled into Greg's shop, desperate for answers. He didn't seem surprised to see me. "You're lucky you got out," he said quietly. "Not everyone does." When I got home, I developed my photos, hoping for proof of what I'd seen. Most of them were normal: trees, leaves, the rusted lantern. But one image was different. It was a picture of my RV taken from the woods. In the corner of the frame, barely visible, was the lantern man, his hollow face glowing in the dark. I haven't gone camping since that trip. I sold the RV and gave up on photographing remote places. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whistle, a faint, haunting melody that sends chills down my spine. I don't know what the lantern man wanted, but I know one thing. He's still out there, waiting for someone else to follow his light.